r/NoSleep. Posted by u/relative tourist 7974. 7 Rules of Survival in Apartment Number 12. It was a humid August day, the air thick with the heavy scent of summer. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the street as I returned home from work. The city was unusually quiet, as if everyone had retreated from the heat. I opened the door to my third-floor apartment in the old residential building where I had lived since childhood. The interior was pleasantly cool, thanks to the thick walls that effectively kept the heat outside. I tossed my bag onto the couch and turned on the fan, which began to hum softly, providing relief in the stuffy air. I had barely a moment to sit down and relax when the phone rang. Jerry's name appeared on the screen, my childhood friend with whom I hadn't been in contact for years. I answered instinctively. "Hello?" I answered uncertainly, wondering what could have prompted him to call right now. "Hi, Harry. It's Jerry. It's been a long time." There was something unsettling in his voice, something that made my heart beat faster. "Hey, Jerry. Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to hide my surprise. "This isn't a conversation for the phone. Do you have time to meet?" We agreed to meet at my apartment at 10:45 p.m. That evening, as the sun began to set, I heard a knock at the door. It was Jerry. He looked different from how I remembered, pale, with something disturbing in his movements. I opened the door and let him in. We sat at the table, and I let him speak. "Harry, I have to tell you something. Something that has been haunting me since that time," he began, his voice trembling. "Do you remember the rules of apartment number 12? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and my heart started to race. Jerry's words brought back memories from our childhood, the first time I saw him. We were 14 when it happened. Jerry lived on the lowest floor, where the bricked-up apartment number 12 was located. It was at the very end of a long corridor, with no other apartments nearby. Apartment number 11 was much earlier, closer to the beginning of the corridor, and apartment number 13 was only on the next floor. There was no other apartment above the bricked-up apartment number 12. My parents forbade me from approaching that apartment. I never understood why until that day. That evening, the sky began to darken faster than usual. Clouds gathered on the horizon, and there was tension in the air. In the distance, I heard thunder, heralding an approaching storm. I had arranged to spend the night at Jerry's place, who lived 2 floors below in the small residential block. I headed for the staircase. I began to descend the stairs, but at the very bottom, I noticed a figure. I descended further. That's when I saw him for the first time, a man with a cigarette. I quickly passed him. Only after passing him was I able to take a closer look. He was standing on the staircase, his face pale, his eyes deep set, staring at me, or so it seemed. After a moment, he moved toward me. I quickened my pace, but before I realized it, he was already behind me. I feared what he might do, but he passed me, heading toward the door marked number 12. I watched as he approached the bricked-up apartment. Then something happened that I will never forget. The man with the cigarette stopped right in front of the door. Slowly, he reached for the handle. My eyes widened in fear and disbelief. The concrete wall vanished as if it had never been there. The man casually walked inside and closed the door behind him. A moment later, Jerry saw me through the peephole and invited me in. I didn't immediately tell him what I had witnessed. It wasn't until several minutes later, when we were alone in his room, that I recounted the incident with the mysterious man. He didn't hide his excitement and suggested that we go there the next day, knowing that his parents wouldn't allow us to go anywhere so late. We agreed on 3 p.m. the following day. In the morning, we had breakfast, and I left his apartment, my mind preoccupied with thoughts of the mysterious man with the cigarette in apartment number 12. As the appointed hour approached, my heart began to race. I entered the staircase, and the atmosphere was strangely tense. When I reached the bottom, I saw Jerry waiting for me. Together, we cautiously approached the apartment. Jerry reached for the handle, but all we saw was a concrete wall. The apartment was bricked up. Jerry accused me of lying, his excitement turning to anger. Suddenly, he stopped, standing still and staring at something behind me. I immediately turned around. There he was. The man with the cigarette stood right behind us, staring straight at the door of apartment number 12. I had never seen him blink. Suddenly, without taking his eyes off the door, he pulled something from his coat, a rolled-up piece of paper, which he extended toward me. Hesitantly, I took it from his hand, and almost immediately, he turned and walked toward the staircase. I stood there, stunned, as the man with the cigarette handed me the paper and silently walked away. Jerry, noticing my inaction, suddenly snatched the paper from me and began to read it. Only when Jerry grabbed the paper and started analyzing its contents did I join him. The contents were handwritten, but it was clear that it had been written in a hurry. The letters were uneven, sometimes crooked, as if the writer's hands were trembling, trying to keep up with their thoughts. Some words were barely legible, smudged by the quick movement of the pen. The content of the note read as follows: Rules of apartment number 12. Remember, before you decide to explore apartment number 12, think twice. Rule 1. You can only enter the apartment between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. This is the only known way to access this apartment. Rule 2. When the clock strikes 3 a.m., you will have 5 minutes to leave the apartment. If you don't, you will notice that where the door should be, there is only a concrete wall. You'll be trapped. If this happens, follow Rule 3. Rule 3. If you are trapped in apartment number 12, know that your chances of survival are slim. After a moment, you will hear wailing coming from the bedroom, growing louder with each passing second. Hide as quickly as possible and pray that it doesn't find you. You will be able to leave the apartment again at 11 p.m. Rule 4. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., you can move freely around the apartment. However, remember that if you enter any room other than the one with the exit, always close the door behind you after leaving that room. Do not re-enter that room. If you do not follow this rule, you will soon hear a quiet wailing, and the apartment's exit door will slowly begin to close. Run to the exit as fast as you can, there might still be hope. Rule 5. In 1967, a woman with long black hair named Isabella was brutally murdered in the bedroom of this apartment. She was skinned and cut into pieces. After this incident, no one wanted to live in the apartment, and the building authorities decided to brick it up. However, for reasons unknown to me, the apartment can be accessed during the previously mentioned hours. So remember, if you hear quiet wailing, know that it's Isabella. Don't look at her, don't turn around, she hates being watched, hates being judged. Rule 6. Don't scream, it will only hasten your painful death. Rule 7. Never turn on light-emitting objects between 11:59 p.m. and 3 a.m. She is drawn to light. After reading the rules, Jerry couldn't hide his excitement. His eyes sparkled, and a smile betrayed his growing adrenaline. "We have to go there," he said firmly. We agreed to go to the apartment at 11 p.m. We told our parents that we were spending the night at our friend Ben's place on the second floor to study for an important math exam. They didn't mind, as it wasn't the first time we had stayed at Ben's. When the night came, the clock read 10:55 p.m., and with hearts pounding, we tried to sneak out of Ben's apartment. Unfortunately, our footsteps woke him from his sleep. Groggy and confused, he asked where we were going. We told him about apartment number 12 and the rules written on the note. Ben frowned as he read the hastily written list of rules, then burst out laughing, unable to believe our story. But Jerry insisted, urging him to come with us and see for himself. "I don't believe you, but it wouldn't hurt to check," he finally said, visibly intrigued. "I'm going with you." Jerry nodded in agreement. The darkness of the night enveloped us, and excitement and tension grew with every step that brought us closer to apartment number 12. As we stood in front of the apartment, we made sure the corridor was empty, then Jerry reached for the door handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, and we held our breath, ready to see what we remembered, a solid, concrete wall that seemed to be the end of our journey. But as the door opened fully, we stood in shock. Instead of the cold, concrete wall that we both so clearly remembered, we saw an ordinary room. The room was dark but fully accessible, as if there had never been any obstacle there. This is impossible," Ben whispered, his confidence dissolving into the air. I stepped closer, hardly believing my own eyes. Jerry stood beside me, just as confused as I was, his hand still resting on the handle. Finally, we snapped out of it and entered the apartment, closing the door behind us. All three of us took out our flashlights after entering the apartment. The first thing that caught our eye after turning them on was the damage. The walls were covered with a thick layer of mold, its dark stains spreading along the rotten surfaces. In some places, the plaster had completely fallen off, revealing the raw brick underneath, and some areas were literally eaten away by moisture. For a moment, I thought I could smell the sickly sweet odor of rotting wood and fungus, which made me nauseous. The windows, barely visible through the semi-darkness, were completely bricked up from the outside. The curtains, which might have once been decorative, were now just shreds, dirty, decayed, and so fragile they could disintegrate at the slightest touch. The furniture in the room was scattered haphazardly. Old armchairs and sofas were caked with dirt, their upholstery consumed by moisture. Trash and shards of glass, which might have once been part of windows or mirrors, were strewn across the floor. Sinister moisture stains hung from the ceiling. In one corner, I noticed the remains of an old, broken chandelier, hanging miserably from a single, creaking chain. Every breath was a struggle, the air in the apartment was heavy, filled with dust and dampness. Yet in all this decay, one thing was most unsettling, the feeling that, despite looking abandoned for decades, the apartment had something in it that made me feel watched. We hesitantly explored what was once a living space until, finally, as we approached the door leading to the bedroom, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Jerry looked at me, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. I felt that something terrible awaited us behind those doors, something we could not even begin to imagine. The smell of rotting meat hung in the air, making me feel sick and only intensifying the sense of unease. The door creaked open, and we stood in the doorway. What we saw exceeded our worst nightmares. The bedroom looked like a scene from a macabre film. The walls were covered in bizarre, chaotic drawings made with blood and something that resembled dried shreds of flesh. In the middle of the room stood an old, decayed bed, its mattress torn and soaked with blood, which had dried over time, forming dark, sticky stains. On the bed lay something we initially took for old, tattered rags. Only after a moment did we realize it was a person. The body was in a state of decomposition, barely holding together. It was scarred, and in some places, its limbs were cut off. Its eyes, empty and lifeless, seemed to be staring straight at us. Then I realized who I was looking at. I was looking at Isabella. I ran out of the room as fast as I could. The sight of the decaying body made my heart pound wildly, and my stomach churned. I felt an uncontrollable shiver run through my entire body. Jerry reacted second. He turned abruptly and, almost losing his balance, ran out of the bedroom. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with fear. Before we reached the front door, I felt I could no longer hold back my nausea. I stopped, doubled over, and vomited onto the floor. My body trembled. I also noticed that, for some inexplicable reason, the apartment door was open. Moments later, Ben ran out of the bedroom, asking what the hell that was. I didn't listen because I realized something that froze the blood in my veins. Ben hadn't closed the bedroom door behind him. Then I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible wail coming from inside the bedroom. The sound was like a moan, slow, full of suffering. Jerry and Ben lifted their heads and looked toward the open bedroom door. I wanted to do the same, but I remembered the rules, the fifth rule. At the same moment, my friends turned their gaze toward the bed. The wailing grew louder, turning into a cry of despair, and I felt pure survival instinct take over. I didn't wait a second longer. I ignored everything. I didn't care what Jerry and Ben were doing, or even if they were running after me. I thought of only one thing: run. I sprang to my feet, leaping over broken furniture and piles of trash. I ran blindly, barely noticing what was in front of me. My heart pounded like a hammer, and my head throbbed with adrenaline. Every step, every stumble in this abandoned, rotten apartment only spurred me to even greater effort. Suddenly, I noticed the door leading to the corridor slowly starting to close. My heart stopped. I knew that if those doors slammed shut, we would be trapped in this cursed apartment, and the hope of escape might disappear forever. Jerry ran beside me, his breathing heavy, his movements full of panic. My heart beat in quick, almost terrifying coordination. Just as the door slammed shut with a loud bang, Jerry and I were already in the corridor. We tumbled out of the apartment, falling to the ground, trying to catch our breath. With a mixture of terror and relief, I looked at Jerry. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran through me as I realized that Ben was still inside. I suddenly collapsed, struggling to stand, but my legs would no longer obey me. I fainted, collapsing onto the cold, dirty corridor floor. I swear, in the moment I fell, I saw him. A man with a cigarette stood at the end of the corridor, smiling at me mockingly. After those events, we decided to remain silent. It was a decision that came hard to us, but we considered it the only possible one. Ben's disappearance was reported, but he was never found. He vanished without a trace. But I still remember. I remember the mocking smile of the man with the cigarette, and that awful moan that haunts me in my nightmares to this day. And though years have passed, I still can't forget what happened to Ben, and I still feel the weight of the fact that he was never found. After Jerry and I finished school, our paths diverged, and I never saw my friend again. Until that evening. Do you remember that horrible evening? That night changed our entire lives, especially mine when I looked into the bedroom that night, and I saw that. What did you see? I asked, worried. I saw Isabella. Her corpse slowly stood up on what used to be legs, and she let out that moan. I saw her grab Ben by the ankles and slowly drag him into the bedroom. I heard his screams, and then the sound of bones breaking. I know that your nightmare probably ended that day, but mine only began. Since then, I hear her at night, I hear her whispers, and they're accompanied by the smell of rotting meat. I was probably the only person who didn't think he was crazy. I was there with him, I saw those things, and I heard that awful moan. In 5 minutes, it'll be 11 p.m. I'm going to that apartment. I can't take it anymore, I have to end this. It dawned on me that I was most likely seeing Jerry for the last time. I watched as he slowly got up from the table and left the apartment.